This is the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm the host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh Podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is sponsored by the Talent War Group. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. In this episode, I spoke with former Navy SEAL Mike Cirelli and former Army officer George Randle, co-authors of the book The Talent War. Mike and George explained how any organization can achieve elite performance if they make talent management their top priority. They shared their concept of hire for character, train for skill. They talked about their definitions of transformative leaders. They explained how there's entrepreneurs at every levels of organizations. They shared their experiences of failure. And they talked about how they self-assess themselves in everything that they do. Mike Cirelli is the CEO of the Talent War Group. Mike is a retired U.S. Navy SEAL with 20 years of experience in special operations. He's the founder and board member of the Vetted Foundation, a 501c3 veteran executive education platform. Mike earned an MBA from the University of Texas McCombs School of Business. He has extensive experience building and leading elite teams in both the military and corporate sectors, successfully transitioning lessons learned from the battlefields of the global war on terror to businesses and their leaders. Mike is a recipient of the Silver Star, 6 Bronze Stars, 2 Defense Meritorious Service Medals, and a Purple Heart for injuries suffered during combat operations. George Randle is a managing partner at the Talent War Group. He's also the vice president of global talent acquisition at ForcePoint, a human-centric cybersecurity company. George has more than 2 decades of experience in talent acquisition at Fortune 100 and Fortune 1000 firms. He's a veteran of the United States Army, where he served as a platoon leader, executive officer, and company commander in Germany, the Middle East, Africa, and Central America. George has trained and coached thousands of veterans on interviewing and career search skills and continues helping our veterans to successfully bring forward critical leadership and management skills that make them invaluable assets to every company they join. In November, Mike and George released their first book, The Talent War: How Special Operations and Great Organizations Win on Talent. Concurrent with the book release, they founded the Talent War Group, bringing together over 40 of the highest performers in special operations, academics, and business to develop a cadre capable of solving the leadership, organizational, and business problems facing small to medium-sized businesses. Their goal? Empower these organizations to achieve excellence every day. All right, Mike, George, welcome to the first episode of the Jedburgh Podcast.
Hey, good to be here. Appreciate you having us on the very first episode.
Number 001, which means, I don't know if you have this in the Special Forces community, we owe you a case of beer.
We have it, and it's usually of my choosing. So I'll come up with a good one, but I am from Boston, so I'm thinking Sam Adams is going to be the way it's at. And I think they have a new hazy one that I might like.
This is the Mark I Mod 0 edition.
Yes.
See, Mike, an Army guy can say Navy terms. It actually does occur in this world.
You got it. Nailed it.
We'll punish you for that later, George. So, guys, I have so many things I want to talk to you about. I mean, I want to talk about the Talent War book. I want to talk about the Talent War group and the leadership collective aspect of that. I want to talk about the characteristics of success and the traits that define human performance at the most elite level. I want to talk about the Army. I guess we'll talk about the Navy. We're going to talk about special operations. But before we start, and George, I don't know if you know this story, but I called up Mike in December. And I don't know if it was right before he had his surgery or right after, but I don't think he was fully involved in the conversation. And I said, hey, look, I have a great idea. I want to start a podcast and I want you to back me. And we're going to go out there and we're going to find prominent visionaries, transformative leaders, drivers of change, people who have won in everything that they've done, but not only won, experienced adversity. They got knocked down, they got dragged out, and they had to stand up and say, how am I going to get back in this? And that's going to be in business, academics, athletics. And we're going to bring them on this show. We're going to talk to them about how we did it in special operations. We're going to talk about how you do it in business and how you do it in athletics. And how do you just wake up every day with the drive to win? And I paused, and Mike, I think he let out a little noise, like he may have been crying. Maybe he was laughing. I don't really know. And then he said, yes, let's do it. And so I have to ask, why did you say yes?
Well, I know you're from Boston, and as you pitched the concept, I immediately thought of Tom Brady.
Oh,
and I'm like, let's absolutely do this.
Oh, my God.
The GOAT.
So just for the audience, George is a Kansas City diehard Chiefs fan. So
George.
He's still suffering from that one. No.
Better team won. The better team won. I got to say that.
It was like watching excellence in action. So, Fran, one, I know you. I know what you stand for. Ultimately, we all talk about leadership a lot. And the ultimate level of leadership that John Maxwell talked about in his 5 levels of leadership is people follow you for who you are and what you represent. And I'm very selective about who I let into my tribe. And I know who you are and what you represent. And I think this podcast is going to go far. And you're actually going to get famous guests, unlike George and I, that bring a much larger audience. So I'm going to apologize for that in advance. But I'm excited to see where you take this, man.
Well, I think you guys are famous. And I think one of the important things that we got to do as we launch this, I was talking to someone about it the other day, is it's not necessarily about attracting everybody, but it's about attracting our guests. It's about attracting the ones who resonate with what we want. And that may not be a billion people, but it can be a lot of people. And I think it's going to be a lot of people. But the important thing is that are the people who listen to this and the people who sit on the other side, are they our listeners? And is it our audience? And that's what's important.
Absolutely.
So George, we got to talk about this concept of the talent mindset. And it's this concept of hire for character, train for skill. You talk about it in the book, and it's how special operations teams recruit, assess, select. You're given hard skills in communications, equipment, medical weapons, explosives, logistics. But what does it mean when you say to someone that I'm going to hire for character and train them for skill if they don't know how to do those hard skill things?
Well, it's 2 things. And one is a quote that Mike and I have made sure that because it really clarifies the talent mindset, which is when you're treating your human capital with the same rigor, discipline, and focus as your financial capital. But when we wrote this book, what makes special operations so special is they had to be experts in potential-based hiring. And so it isn't the logistics. It isn't the high-speed gear. It isn't the new night vision goggles, the latest weapon, the latest imagery. It's none of that. It's always about the people. And when we wrote the book, we have put in a ton of examples where everybody hired for experience. And you get people that don't have the character traits, and that's always where it goes off the rails. When you get in times of stress, times of COVID, it's character that matters. It's not the skills. It's not the experience. And, frankly, experience just isn't predictive of success. Sometimes it is, but it's not necessarily so.
So how do you get a leader or a hiring manager or someone who's in that decision-making authority to adopt that culture, to get them to say, I don't care if this person doesn't have 10 years in the industry. I don't care if they don't know how to do these certain skills. I can teach them that, but I'm going to take the risk and I'm going to get everybody on my team and everybody in the company on board to say, we're going to invest in this person. What do you say to those leaders and how do you get them to change that attitude?
Well, someday, doing this for 20 years, sometimes it would have been quicker and faster to use a great big stick, which would have got my point across a lot earlier and they would learn the lesson a lot quicker. But it's telling the right story. And I would tell you, if you're out there and you're a leader and you're trying to make the point to your fellow leadership or your HR or talent acquisition trying to make that point, look around your own company. Look at your A players within your own company. And I'm willing to bet you that over 50% of the A players in the company, the roles they're in now, they didn't have the experience for or weren't hired into. Those are your argument to hire more of those A players. It's probably the best and quickest argument that you're going to make to leaders in your own company versus just the standard kind of trust me. Now that Mike and I have written the book, it certainly helps us that, it's one of the things we want to do is provide people a tool that they can literally walk through with people and share them the arguments of why hiring character is so important. But you're going to have to tell the story from the point of view of the rock stars that you have on board and how they're making a difference and how that experience doesn't have anything to do with them being an A player in your firm.
I'll tell you, this is super important to me because my first job out of the Army, I worked at Merrill Lynch. And I was recruited there to go be a financial advisor. And I literally got a note on my LinkedIn. I was at the end. I was getting ready to get out. I only had another month left in the Army and I had no idea what was going to come next. I tried for everything, but everything shut me down because I didn't have those hard skills. At that time, it was before I had my MBA. I didn't know how to read a balance sheet. I didn't know what a P&L was. I didn't have these 15, 20 years of experience. I had 13 years in the Army, but it was really difficult to translate. And so I got this notice on my LinkedIn that this financial advisor from Merrill Lynch, who's now one of my best friends, I have to give a shout out to Rick Nelson. And he said, I don't care that you've never done this. You have a history of demonstrated success in what you've done up to this point. And I can teach you how to be a financial advisor. And what was important when they took me in there is that I showed up day one and they said, welcome, but guess what? You have 4 months of training.
Exactly.
And so for the next 4 months, that was all I did. The stack of books was like a foot high. And it was, you're going to sit here for 8 hours a day and you're going to study. And so you have another quote where you've said that humans get better with investment. And so I'm hoping that maybe you can talk a bit about what does that mean? Because what is the investment that has to come in those people when they actually show up on day one after you've made this decision internally that you're going to bring them in, you're going to hire for the character and the potential, but now what that they're standing in front of you in the door?
Well, I know Mike, and I want Mike a chance to hammer this home because he's kind of led by example here at EF Overwatch and with the talent work group, that we pour into training into our people constantly because you're going to get it back 3, 4, and 5x. But to your earlier point about the experience and stuff and people coming on, you having 4 months of training, you know, the experience, all it does is maybe shorten the learning curve a little bit, but it's still just as tall when you walk into a brand new environment. And we had Brian Decker, who contributed to our book, who's the ex-Special Forces, who's now the Vice President of Player Development with the Indianapolis Colts. And he said, you know, I was hired for what I don't know rather than what I know. And he was hired for his history of success, to your point. But once people get in the door, they have to learn your culture. They have to learn your systems, the formal and the informal systems. They have to learn your product. They have to learn your go-to-market sales motions. They have to learn how you take care of your customers, because even competitors that are as close as you can get do things completely differently. So the experience only matters when it comes to shortening the height of the learning curve. It's still going to be steep for anybody walking in the door. So you're going to have to invest in them. That's on the onboarding new hire piece. And that doesn't even go to what Mike nails, which is mentoring, coaching, and training those people.
Well, and Mike, you talk all the time about how no one who comes into special operations in any of the branches has ever been in special operations before, yet the entire selection process is designed to go out and find those people. What about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And Fran, you're the perfect example of that. I mean, you came from a very strong pedigree, but you didn't know a darn thing about special operations. If we took you on one day of assessment and selection and said, hey, go run a direct action raid or go run a reconnaissance mission, you would have looked at the instructors and say, I don't know how to do that.
I just would have started running. That's it.
Yeah.
You want me to run where?
But they knew you had all the attributes to be a high-performing individual within the community. And that's, I mean, the assessment and selection process, which is extremely difficult, is designed to elicit behaviors. Does this person demonstrate the behaviors that indicate they're going to be a high performer within whatever role, whatever domain? And that's why special operations has become so good, but they didn't get there overnight. This assessment and selection process, and for the listeners, assessment and selection is what we call it in the military. This is what you call hiring. Assessment and selection for special operations has been honed, innovated, and adapted and evolved for over half a century now. And guess what? We still get it wrong. But we do have the longest behavioral interview, which has a high probability of selecting who's going to be highly successful. The thing that a lot of people don't understand, and you talked about stepping into Merrill Lynch and you step right into a training program, is up front, a company assesses the recruits and they select the right ones or who they think are the right ones into their company. But that assessment process never stops. After that, it's train, develop, and assess, almost on a continuous loop. Train, develop, and assess. Train, develop, and assess. Is this person ready for the next level in the organization? And once they get there, the training starts all over again, as well as the development, and they assess him for the next level or her for the next level and the next level. So it's a never-ending cycle. I want to touch on one thing you did ask, George. How do you convince a boss to step away from old, archaic, ineffective practices, such as hiring for experience, and test hiring for potential? And sometimes, most of the time, that is very hard to do. And you plead your case, as George said, you tell a good story, but sometimes you got to let that boss fail. Override, we're not going with this individual, we're going with the man or woman with 15 years of marketing experience, and let that hire fail. let them fail, and then reinforce why.
So I want to build on that and talk about how we lead off this podcast every time. One of the first things we say, and one of the first things that every listener is going to hear in this, and they heard it in the beginning, is the core principle of the Jedburgh Podcast, and that's that organizations will fail without transformative leaders. And in essence, what I think I hear you saying is that you're asking that leader of that organization to invest in a potential transformative leader with the maximum potential to bring to that organization. And so, Mike, you've talked about transformational versus transactional leaders. Can you talk to the difference between the two and how you classify those?
Yes, absolutely. So first off, in order for someone to be effective, they have to understand the hard skills of any job or function. But what ultimately separates a high-performing leader, aside from somebody who's a high-performing tactician, is that a transformational leader builds genuine relationships with their people. And that requires time and effort. I'm of the believer that a lot of people step into leadership positions in life and they're not willing to pay the rent every day. And that rent is time away from your own family to get to know your people, what drives them, where they want to be in 5 years, and putting that time in. You did this within your ODA, Fran, and for the listeners, an ODA is an Operational Detachment Alpha, 12 badass Army Green Berets that will go into any environment lone and unafraid, as we say.
And I have to say that a SEAL just said that. So we have, for the record, that came from a Navy SEAL. You give the love. I know, you give the love.
You know, I'm one of the biggest outspoken fans of the Special Forces community. I'm a fan of all of them, man. But you had to know every one of your guys. I'm sure to a degree you knew how many children they had, boys and girls, birthdays sometimes. I know that has nothing to do with the actual function of the job. But when your people know that you care and that you're willing to invest in them, sometimes at the peril of yourself, then they will move heaven and earth to drive that organization forward, because they're going to follow you, like I said from the start, because of who you are and what you represent. Now, that transactional leader just does the job. At 4 p.m., 5 p.m., they hit the clock. They don't care about their people. They just want to go home, and they'll reconvene during the next business day. And we are all big fans and believers that the U.S. military is the world's greatest leadership development program. And even though we taught it at length to all military members, sometimes it didn't stick. And we saw those transactional leaders that only cared about themselves and their units usually were not as effective or failed on the battlefield.
So you see a lot of these transformational leaders who sit in positions of what I would call entrepreneurs, right? The public sees them as people who have a tremendous amount of charisma. They have a vision. They have a drive. They've had this great idea. And so if you think about it in terms of people who've built great organizations as being a transformational leader, somebody who had this vision, and then you take this term entrepreneur and entrepreneurial, which I often have a difficult time with because I think it gets overused. It gets classified in so many different ways. And then it becomes stigmatized. And people think that in order to be an entrepreneur, I have to have a great idea. I have to have the next Facebook or Twitter, or I have to have some autonomous vehicle. If I don't sit at home late at night and come up with this amazing idea, I can't be an entrepreneur. But I would say that entrepreneurs live in all functions of organizations. They live in every department, and they can even live at the most junior level in an organization if you're in an organization where people actually give bottom-up input. So I'm interested in for the both of you, what your definitions of entrepreneur are and where you see them fitting into organizations, and how do you create an environment where everybody can be an entrepreneur? Or is it centralized at the top?
So leadership sets a tone. I'm going to say that from the start. And the leaders, when they set the tone, they also set a culture. And if I were going to set a culture of any organization, whether it's a Fortune 500 with 10,000 employees or a small startup with 5 employees, I want everyone to be a disruptive thinker. I want everyone to have a sense of autonomy over their lives and their jobs, ownership to make decisions at their respective level, or to seize opportunities without coming to me so that they can move quickly. And if you build that culture, naturally people are going to lean forward. The biggest thing, Fran, I'll say is when you do set that culture at first, and then one of your young subordinate leaders makes a mistake and you come down on them, you'll kill that initiative right off the bat. They'll never want to take another risk again. And we dealt with this recently with one of our young employees. He made a command decision It didn't work out. And in fact, George was texting me on the side saying, hey, handle this one with care because this is actually an opportunity to gain more ownership as a leader. And we said, we backed him. We said, hey, you made a command decision. It didn't work out, but we want to applaud you for the fact of making that decision. Now, if I was going to run an organization, regardless of domain, whether it's investment banking, services-based company, manufacturing, or tech, I want to create a company of entrepreneurs at every level. But you want disruptive thinkers. You want people with this curiosity in their belly, always looking at the way we do things, saying, is this smart? Is there a better way to deliver a better product or service to our customer that will outpace our competition? Now, I know a lot of companies are using the term entrepreneur, which I absolutely love. And when I look back at my time in special operations, I'm sure much like you did, we actually bred it into our people. And often we handed them problems, real world problems for which no book solutions existed. My term was officer troop commander, and I was never the dude with the idea. But I would watch my guys in the face of a problem, true bottom-up leadership, look at the problem, and they would come together and they would solve it a lot more effectively and faster than I ever could on my own.
No, I usually have the worst ideas. I had the ideas where they were looking at me going, you don't even know what you're talking about. But you have to be willing, as a leader, you have to be willing to sit there and say, you know what, you're probably right. Because back to the previous points, I hadn't done that before. I came into that organization for my potential and my skill. My hard skill was planning. My hard skill was bringing resources to the organization. It was to develop deliberate action plans that others would execute at a high level of precision and skill. It wasn't necessary to come up there and say, oh, I have the best idea to do this thing, because I was sitting in a room with people who've been doing that very thing for 20 years. And so you've got to be able, as a leader, to sit back and say, you know what? Maybe I don't have the good idea. I still spoke up because you want to have that conversation in case there is that opportunity. And so you don't want to be afraid of that. But all the time, everybody had a better idea.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to take off on that Mike hit that I love, because I've spent the last 20 years in the corporate grind. And I've been in some bureaucracies that make the Army look like it runs smoothly and without a hitch. And one of the terms that Mike used that I loved all of them, but one that stood out to me is the curiosity. Mike and I, when we wrote the book, we operated under best idea wins. I have stolen that term from him and plagiarized it as much as I can. But the curiosity thing, the people on the teams that I built, I like when people go, what aren't we doing and what could we be doing? And to Mike's point, they're empowered to see an opportunity and seize that opportunity and say, especially in corporate America, because everything's so siloed. And so in my function, HR and talent acquisition, people can get overly siloed. And the first thing is they go, oh, that's not my lane. That's not what I do. But I love those people who are curious just about our function. They know our overall mission and they say, well, why aren't we doing that? And then come up with something to go deliver and build out our capabilities and competencies. So that curiosity to me when I hire people into my teams is huge.
So I agree 100%. I also, 3 words come to my mind when I think about this, and it's accountability, responsibility, and ownership. And so you talk about empowerment, right? And you talk about, can you create an organization where there's an empowerment at every level to solve problems, to contribute to the idea, to be somebody who can stand up and say, yes, I can do this, and then own that problem, right? Once somebody in the room as a leader says, yeah, okay, go ahead, this is yours, go execute, develop the plan, let me know what you need, and go do it. But then you have this differentiation, and it's a small differentiation, I think, between accountability, responsibility, and ownership. What do you think about that?
At different positions, you can carve those words up a lot of different ways. And I've actually, when I talk to my team, we stress the ownership piece because the accountability and responsibility falls on the leaders, generally speaking, or from just a raw or pure definition standpoint. Ultimately, I am responsible and accountable for everything that happens on my team, good, bad, right, wrong, and different. I'm accountable for it. But that ownership piece is what I want people taking, and I want them to understand that I have the faith in them. And to Mike's point earlier, that if they fail, hey, that's on me. That's not on them. So they don't have a fear of failure, and they know that we have a great amount of faith in their ability to take ownership and deliver solutions that we never thought of. So ownership and backing them up means that person feels like you believe in them, you have faith in them, and you trust what they're going to do and what they're going to deliver.
I think these are three sort of hallmarks of a highly effective organization when you look at it. So when we talk about accountability, again, I always default back to my special operations time. It sucks. And I've been in the business world now, but I always default back because I'm a believer that special operations is one of the most effective, agile, just innovative organizations in the world. And I think that's why the business world has a fascination with it. But as I look back at these three key words, accountability, what set the special operations community aside was when we talk about accountability, we're actually talking about self-accountability. Is that you are a highly disciplined individual who's going to hold themselves accountable because often you were in a place where nobody else was around and you were going to be asked, hey, did you do it the right way? And so you had to make sure that you were taking the right actions. Responsibility, it does fall within somebody's wheelhouse. And if it falls within your wheelhouse, I know there's people are going to step up and say, hey, that's my role and responsibility. It falls in my lane and it didn't get done or it did get done. And ultimately ownership, regardless of who was responsible for the task, I expect every single member of my team to step up and take ownership over the problem, even if somebody's name is attached to it, and help that individual solve it, help the organization learn from it, become better, and hopefully never repeat that same mistake.
So, Mike, you said a phrase, do it the right way. Well, what about when somebody gives you the phrase that I know you love because I know you well, and they tell you, but hey, that's the way we've always done it, man.
Oh, God.
He's getting out of his chair.
Here we go.
He's squirming in his chair now.
I'll throw this back at you guys. The people that usually said that were the people that had a lot of tenure in an organization. And what I'm really saying, without calling George out, is they were old as hell.
Experienced.
They were experienced in life, but if they were older, they were set in their ways, and they're at a point in life where they just don't want to change, innovate, or adapt. And we all know that the one thing that's constant in life, yes, death and taxes, as Benjamin Franklin said, but change is also that third constant. Everything is always changing around us. Our competition's trying to maneuver. The battlefield's changing in a business setting that is a hyper-competitive digital transformation environment. And if you're not willing to constantly change on a daily basis, then you will become irrelevant within your domain. And so, yeah, when somebody says this is the way we've always done it, you should have, as a leader, that allergic reaction of that person has no more curiosity. They're not willing to do what's necessary to adapt and win.
So we got to go a little deeper on that and I want to tie it back to the Jedburgh podcast, right? And this concept of who are the Jedburghs. And so that's transitioned back, all the way in through their time as in the CIA Special Activities Division into Special Operations in all branches. But there's an element of rapport, okay? And when the Jedburghs jumped into occupied France, their number one mission was to link up with the French resistance forces. And they had to build this team, right? And it's not like they jumped into every single area and all of a sudden every French resistance leader embraced them and said, yes, please, we want to work with you. They met people like this. They met people who said to them, no, we don't care that you have this idea. We don't care that you bring weapons and ammunition, and we don't care that you're here to help us to defeat the Germans, right? They said, this is our area. We know this area better than you. This is the way we do it, and you have to do it our way. So when you experience that leader, and I've experienced it in the corporate world all the time, where you go in, you're a transformative leader, and you say, I want to do it this way. And somebody says, no, I was here from the start. You weren't. This is the way we're going to do it. What do you have to do? Because you have to bridge that gap.
Oh, it happens to me a lot, all the time. I had this guy named Colonel Smith when I was in the Berlin Brigade, and he spent a lot of time in special operations. And
after World War II, you have a bunch of great.
Yeah, I know. It was, this is, man, I'm getting it. The Chiefs lost, my gray showing through. This is brutal. But he told me something that I thought was really important, because there are those people that are going to tell you that. And corporate America, when you have a new way of doing something, it doesn't mean you're doing a 180. He said, George, plagiarize the good shit that's working and then make it better. Add something to it. You don't always have to break glass to do something different. Find the good in something. And so I took that lesson. And so being in talent acquisition, we've been thought of as order takers since, the 10 Commandments came down practically. And no, I wasn't alive when that happened, just so we're all clear on that.
Just shortly after.
Just shortly thereafter. But that's the thing. When somebody says that, Mike and I have an allergic reaction to it. And there are the realities in corporate America that you're going to have to tell the story. You're going to have to plagiarize the good part and say, well, what if we shift 10 degrees to the right? What if we modify this? I have a better result that I expect to get than the result. The scary part, that when people say we've always done it that way, generally they're accepting mediocrity and they're saying we can't get better. And that's a frightening situation.
Or their ego is so massive. So, and Fran, as we talk about the Jedburghs, the Jedburghs and the Scouts and the Raiders were all the precursor to the United States Special Operations Command, which started with the U.S. Army Special Forces. But not only were the Jedburgh teams not always accepted by the French, they weren't accepted by a lot of the senior military leadership. They were not hot on that concept.
No.
I remember the early days of, Afghanistan. If you remember, a lot of senior military leadership cringed at the picture of Special Forces soldiers with the big beards on the ground, who were just doing that from a cultural standpoint to look a lot like a tribal elder who also had a big beard. But that didn't resonate well with your conventional-minded leader who naturally pushed back. So what I would tie that into is when you step into a corporate setting and you're not the boss, and your boss is that person that is rigid and pushing against it, you don't have much choice. And you actually have to fight the long game on that one. Because if you go direct, what I call frontal assault with your boss and say, hey, your idea is stupid, I just gave you a better way of doing that, that's probably not going to work out well. And I always think of the SF community as taking an indirect approach. This is almost like psychological warfare. One, support your boss and try to get little victories of pinning him down a path of why your idea may become more efficient and more effective. But that's the long game. You really have no other choice in that scenario.
So I have a great piece of advice I was given. I have to share it because I can't move on without doing it. But there's a gentleman by the name of Ron Iden. Ron Iden is the chief security officer of Walt Disney World, of Walt Disney, everything Disney. Okay. And he's been a mentor of mine. Actually, we're going to have him on. I'm already talking to him. We're going to have him on. All right. So Ron was in the FBI. He had an entire career in the FBI. And then he came to Disney when Disney started realizing that they actually may have a security threat. And actually, he'll tell the story eventually, but that was a very long time into the tenure at Disney before they decided to hire a head of security. He's the only one who's there. He's been their only chief security officer. Okay. And he's been there for decades. And I asked him this question once. I said, Ron, how have you lasted there? And he looked at me and he said, you cannot jam it down their throat. Mm-hmm. And he just looked at me. And now here I am, right? I'm from Boston. So you don't like it. Well, then we jam it down your throat until you smile and say, yes, I actually liked it. And well, it doesn't work. I mean, as you said, right? You go head to head with your boss. It doesn't matter what they think. You're going to lose. You're going to lose every day. And his perspective on it was you give them a little bit. You give them the options. You tell them how it could have been. And you have to be able to accept a little bit of risk. And when you accept a little bit of risk, you got to be there in the back when it happens and come forward and say, hey, remember that thing I told you? If we had done it this way, maybe we wouldn't be there. What do you think we give it a shot now? And if you can do that time and time again, and you take the 2 inches, the 3 inches, a little bit more every time, eventually you get there. But if you look at someone and you say, I'm putting a stake in the ground and this is it, you're going to lose.
How often have people put, as we call it in the military, you put your sword in the sand? How often does that work out in their favor? And it's usually 1 out of 10 times. They lose almost all the time. The other thing, even if you warned your boss to take a certain course of action towards an initiative and they decided to go with their plan and their plan fails, that's where a lot of patience and tact come in. Even though it's in your mind, you want to say, I freaking told you to go with my plan. Look, yours failed. Again, you're going to miss an opportunity to actually, as you said, gain that inch or two to ultimately get to where you want.
I want to hit on that because there's this element of risk. And Mike, you've talked about risk and you've talked about risk tolerance and risk identification and risk as an opportunity. And so my background with security and business continuity, that was always our job. It's to identify threats, and threats turn into different levels of risk. But then you have to work with leadership to identify their risk tolerance level. How much risk are they willing to accept? And then you have to come together and say, okay, based on how much risk you're willing to accept, these are the things that we can do. And that's easier said than done when you're not the ultimate decision maker. And so as you've talked about this mindset of creating a risk culture where risk is acceptable, how do you actually train that? How do you get people to accept that and take a step back and say, okay, you know what? I'm willing to fail on this, because nobody wants to be the one who goes in and says, I understood the risk, I accepted the risk, and we still failed.
I'm going to have to go trace back who I heard this phrase from, because I've got no original ideas whatsoever. Like George said, with the great advice, steal somebody's idea and make it better.
Plagiarize the good.
Yeah, plagiarize the good, make it better. That doesn't hurt my ego. But, it might have been Bill Campbell who said reward failure. Mm-hmm. And for the audience, Bill Campbell, the $1 trillion coach, the secret coach of Silicon Valley, former Steve Jobs' best friend, former CEO of Intuit. The guy was amazing. But he told a story of where, when at Intuit, one of his senior VPs took calculated risk. And I think we should cover that there's a difference between calculated risk and recklessness. But did everything right. If there was a lot of risk involved with the initiative, did everything right in terms of planning and due diligence and trying to mitigate risk down to the lowest level, and failed. And where I think Bill, being extremely smart, knew that everyone thought Bill was going to come off the top rope and just cut the guy's head off. And he did the exact opposite, walked into the room with all the other senior leaders and said, hey, I want to applaud you. I want to applaud you for the risk that you took. The company is better for it. We didn't win this one, but guess what? We're going to reset. We're going to take what we learned and create another service line. And people were shocked. And Bill talked about how he did that intentionally of course, he used some colorful language to get his people to grow some other things and actually to start taking the initiative. But Fran, I'm preaching to the choir. We bred this into our young special operations soldiers of no risk, no reward. Now, that's not saying go big or go home, but we taught them to look at risk and see the upside, not the negative. Most humans, 99% of humans, see risk and it triggers fear. And how do you teach somebody to look at the upside? I mean, our guys are jumping out of planes. They're diving below the water at night in the ocean. These men and women learn quickly to see the upside risk and how to take advantage of it to move their organization forward. But embracing failure is a big part of that. You accepted risk, you calculated it, you seized the initiative, but you ended up failing, and you reward that person. And by doing that, setting a behavior, you showed them that they still won. They didn't lose, they learned. The organization is better. Special operations was equipped to win the global war on terror, every battle we were tasked with. I know we can argue we lost the war, but our special operations soldiers won every battle they were tasked with because of what the Green Berets and the Navy SEALs and the Air Force Special Operations did in the 80s, 90s, accepting risk and training and trying new techniques, parachuting from 15,000 feet and then bumping it up to 22,000 feet where they needed oxygen and then taking it to 30,000 feet. And I remember the guys telling the story about they pushed the limits and they went to 36,000 feet. And after that jump, they're like, that was not a good idea. Let's go back to 30.
We're good. I mean, but there was information, right? They used information that they gained in each one of those iterations to iterate on it and make it better. And so it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't where they just stood up and said, hey, we're going to go straight to 36,000 feet, right? They looked at it, they had data, they understood that data, they understood that new classification of data, then created a next level of opportunity. It still had its risks, they understood and defined them, but it created a next level of opportunity that they went to. Because I would argue that the opposite of that is hubris. And if you just stand up and say, hey, I'm going straight to the top, just like I'm going to look at my boss and I'm going to tell my boss, I don't really care what you want to do. This is what we're going to do. That's hubris. And that ends in failure.
Yeah, Fran, I will say for the audience, we talked about change. Change being constant. As we get older, we resist change. Risk is a lot. It almost parallels that. I mean, look at investments. When you're younger and you start to work with a financial advisor, you usually start out very aggressive with your mutual funds, your ETFs. And over time, as you get older, they switch that risk management to conservative. Understandably, that makes sense. But again, as we get older, we become more senior in organizations. We have to remember our roots of the days when we were willing to test things accept the failure, learn, and grow. And history is littered with organizations, Fortune 500s, that became complacent, that thought their business model was sound and we no longer need to innovate and adapt. And they're no longer with us today. Blockbuster is a great example of that. Who could have bought Netflix for, I think the price tag I read was $50 million, which based off the strength of their balance sheet, they could have bought it like 10 times over. But they said, no, we're good. We don't need you.
Let's talk about this failure for a little bit, because you guys talked about something in the book that I laughed a little bit, and I know George has spoken about it at times in some of the things he's done and some of the interviews he's done since you guys have released the book, where he said that human behavior is at times comical. And so I watched a clip, I think it was...
Spend a week in HR and it will just frighten you into being an entrepreneur and only having one employee, I promise you.
Well, you made that comment a few weeks ago, George, and I saw it and I was like, but then it stopped and then it got cut off. And I don't know if that was the end of your point or the end of the clip, but I was like, no, wait, I need an example. And that was kind of the journalist in me, because I think the other thing that I haven't told you guys, and I don't know if you know, is I studied journalism. That was my undergrad degree. I went to Boston University to become a journalist, and then I watched in 9/11 all these guys, as Mike, as he said, with long hair and beards, riding horses, changing the world. And still I looked in and I was like, oh no, hey, I'm going to be a war correspondent. That's what I'm going to go do. And then as a couple of years went on and I saw this, I said, no way. I got to go be the one who is making the impact, is changing the world. I wanted to be that kind of transformative leader. And so I said, no, I can always be a journalist. I'm going to do it later. But kind of a side note that some of you had said earlier. But back to my point. Sorry, I digressed. You classify people in 3 buckets when you ask them about their failures. And that's 1, people who cannot think of a time they failed. It's 2, those who failed but cannot show what they learned from it. And 3, those who describe failure, how they overcame it, and how they improved moving forward. Now, no one's going to argue that in the interview process, you want to hear 3. But I need to ask you, do people really do number 1?
Yeah.
I mean, do people really come in and say, like, I've never failed?
Yes, and it takes all of my professional discipline not to kill the interview at that point. I'm still courteous. I still make sure they have a good experience. But you know what? Usually that spurs me on, especially when I'm interviewing executives. And somebody says, well, I've never failed. Okay. So you're telling me that you've never set a goal and not come up short. You've hit your number every month or exceeded it every single month without failure for the past 25 years. Well, if I look at it that way, usually you can dig. It's just they're not. The first thing that it tells me, honestly, 2 things that it tells me if they say I haven't failed. Number 1, they're not humble. Number 2, they're not introspective. And so those 2 things by themselves really rule you out. Now, usually, I hate to admit this, but Mike's seen me do it. You know the old expression when you're up there briefing some PowerPoint slide to a general officer, you think you have the answer, but you don't, and you end up twisting in the wind on the end of a rope. I'll do that from time to time in an interview just to, when somebody tells me they haven't failed. And just for the listeners out there, if you're interviewing, I don't care if you're a C-suite executive or otherwise, failure is just one more opportunity to learn and get better. And if you've succeeded and you've not had any obstacles in front of you, I want to meet that person. If I dig long enough, I'll find them. It's frightening. And there's tons of people that out of 10 people that I ask, 5 of them will fall in the bucket of number 1. 5 out of 10.
Wow. I would have put 2. I would have said 2.
No, like I said, it's comical. And it's tough to maintain your professional bearing and sit there and say, really? Really? Can I get your wife or your husband on the phone or your mom on the phone? Everybody has failed at something they've tried. And it just tells me they're not introspective and they're not humble.
Or they haven't tried.
Yeah, true. And it's a little bit frightening because if they're not, that's the other thing we talk about talent. Mike and I, if somebody tells us that they failed, we're like, okay, the failure part of that question goes away. We forget about it almost. We're now just zeroed in, dialed in on what did you learn? And then from that, the next time you tried that, how much further did you go from that learning? Because that's what we're interested in the interview, not the fact that you failed. It's the self-development. It's the self-improvement. It's the person that says, I can always get better. That's ultimately what you're looking for in an interview, but you still have people, nope, haven't failed.
But I have to imagine that people are scared about that question.
No, I was going to say the first bucket shows a lack of humility. Second bucket shows a lack of self-reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And number 3 shows actually humility, self-reflection, and resiliency.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, number 3 is so powerful. Let's be honest, if you don't have humility, if you're suffering from hubris, you're a cancer to any organization you step into.
Yep.
It's the complacency that you think you have everything figured out. But, and Fran, George and I talk about this a lot, and you know about it. Self-reflection is the tool we utilize. Well, one, in the military, we call that the after-action review, the debrief. Self-reflection is the personal process you use to identify how to get better. And if you lack that, you lack curiosity and drive to become the optimal human being.
Yep.
So this has opened up a whole bunch of the character traits that you guys define in the talent war. And in the definition of the character traits, you identify these 9, but then you talk about this concept of the whole man. And we've adopted that on the Jedburgh Podcast as a collection of folks and conversations with folks who have specific traits. And they're very good at a bunch of things, but it's the whole of the individual that makes them great at what they do. Can you talk to the whole man concept and the criticality of the whole man concept as you assess your leaders?
You know what, George? I thought he was going to open that up a different way and basically ask Mike, interesting. That's an interesting concept. Where'd you learn that from?
I thought so too. I was like, I'm waiting for it.
Here
He
it
didn't say it. I'm like, all right, so let's go back to the failure part. He failed to ask the critical question.
Oh, I need to learn from it now.
Fran, in 2008, I had a great opportunity to bring out 2 Navy SEAL young junior officers that just passed SEAL selection. And I was a guest instructor at phase 2 of the Special Forces qualification course. So naturally, they brought me in and they showed me the process from Special Forces assessment selection all the way through the Q course. And that's where I was introduced to the whole man concept. And I was blown away by how further ahead the Army Special Forces community was on actually establishing a process, other than oral history, a process of asking themselves, what are we truly looking for in these candidates, other than being physically fit and, confident and resilient? Like, what are the attributes we're looking for? And as I dug into the history, they held panels of battalion commanders and command sergeant majors from the community of breaking down the attributes that made certain Green Berets so highly effective at being a Green Beret. And they came up with a list of, and I'm blanking on it, George, I think it was...
like 14 or 15, I think.
Yeah, I think it was 12.
Yeah.
But they basically dove into the whole man concept, which comes from ancient Greece philosophy, that people that have a fit mind and a fit body are more equipped to deal with the pressures of life, especially a special operations life, where you're thrust into the most volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments. And you really need a set of attributes that make up the whole man in order to be effective in an environment like that.
You know what? And one of the reasons that we talked about it, let me just give you the simple example from a talent acquisition perspective, doing this for 20 years. You're hiring more than the resume. You're hiring the person. So we wanted to get that concept out there that was so richly developed by the special operations community, special forces. And the other thing is, what drives your company is not the bullets on that resume. It is that whole person. It is those attributes. When your company's behind, or you're trying to innovate, or you're trying to drive sales, you're trying to break in a new market, it's the whole person. And if you don't know that concept, and that's why we put it in the book, and you're just hiring off a piece of paper, it's like rolling the dice in selection.
So now I have to put you guys on the spot and talk about your own selection processes. You guys came together, you wrote this book, The Talent War, and it is a good book. And I'm not just saying that because I'm affiliated with you guys in the Talent War group and you're sponsoring my podcast. It is actually a very good book. And I was telling Mike the other day that I'm building out a talent management cycle for a company that I'm working with. And I actually took the book out and I started going down, like literally chapter by chapter, going, did I cover this? Did I cover this? Did I cover this? And it's turning out to be very good because I plagiarized the good stuff. So,
it's copyrighted, by the way. Just be mindful.
I literally called Mike. I'm like, I just took everything out of the book for this project. But you guys had to select each other. And I have to assume, and I haven't written a book, but I have to assume that this is almost somewhat like an arranged marriage of some sorts. But this is a long process. And you guys have both commented that writing the book is one of the most challenging things that you've ever had to do. And so it's one thing to have to do it on an individual level. It's another thing to have to do it collectively. And so what did you look for in each other when you set out and said, okay, I want to write this book, but I got to find the partner to do that? And so how did you assess each other in terms of these traits, these characteristics, and look at to say, yeah, we can do it?
George and I didn't meet in the military. We actually met on what I consider to be one of the last professional social media tools and extremely powerful, LinkedIn. And George reached out, realizing that I was in Austin. He was in the military. He followed extreme ownership. And he said, hey, would you love to meet for breakfast? And we met at an iconic Austin breakfast joint. And then from there, it was almost like a bromance in action, because we both believed in the same exact things. And we knew the power of a strategically minded HR leader and how they can change organizations. And from there, we started to work together. And then not taking credit for this, I think I was watching some horrible reality TV show with my wife, which I'm forced to do every evening. Let's make sure she doesn't listen to the show.
What is it? No, you don't get off that easy. What
Good for you, Fran. Good for you for digging in. That's that journalistic side. Go pound him.
We ask questions on this podcast. This is not a walk in the park.
I think it was Married at First Sight, which is just a god-awful show. I'm not a fan of any reality TV. I think it's the devil reincarnate. But I looked at her, I'm like, yeah, I've got to step out, call George. And she's almost tired of George at this point. And I'm sure his wife is like, oh, great, Mike's calling.
Same thing.
Full stop, I got to take the call. So I called George. I'm like, hey, man, listen. Nobody ever wants to be the Navy SEAL that's like, we need to write a book. Because that's the cliche of all cliches.
Every SEAL writes a book.
Oh, no. It's part of the training.
They just normally don't do it with somebody else, especially someone from the Army.
Yeah. And this is almost like if you had known George, you would have brought the special operations expertise where he had the talent acquisition piece. And we knew the concept from the start. Now, that's the first step. And then from there, it was not easy, dude, because one, halfway through, you're like, this is complete crap. We're never going to come up with something good. Two, getting over the fact that you've got to put yourself out there. When you publish the book, you are putting yourself out there. And we're stewards of our own relationship. We're the guardians of our reputations. And that's what George and I wanted to safeguard, is that we wanted to put something out there that was going to be impactful for business owners. And it got to a point to where we were in the 10th revision of the final manuscript. And we're like, you know what? We hate our own book. And somebody's like, good. Then that means it's time to release it. And we're like, what are you talking about? They're like, if you hate your own book, it means you're ready. And we could have went through 20 more revisions and the thing still probably wouldn't be released. But we eventually said, fine, let's just get it out there.
And that's a long journey. I mean, you guys have talked about how it took, a year or so?
Well, it's supposed to take about 2.5 is what they told us. And, when I met Mike for breakfast at Kirby Lane, I mean, well, first of all, we both nerd out on talent. So, you have that in common. But then you can't be around Mike and not see the passion and drive about whatever he's going to dig into. It's Mach 2 with his ass on fire. That's just how it works. And immediately wanted to gravitate towards that when it came towards talent. But yeah, writing, you know what, Mike, we need to be honest. The hardest part of the whole book process was the audio recording of the book.
Smoked.
Mike called me. He says, dude, this smoked me. And I'm like, so first in my head, I'm thinking, he's bullshitting me. I know he is. But then it starts resonating in my head. I'm like, okay, if Cirelli's telling me he's smoked, this is going to be brutal. And I got to tell you, he didn't even describe it enough. Doing the audio version of that book was truly one of the tougher things I've done. To read your own material, Mike reading mine, reading all the stuff we put together, and doing it right with it was tough. It was tough. It took a lot of time.
8 a.m. to 5 p.m. for 2 days straight for each of us.
Really?
And I just went home and I looked at my wife and I'm like, don't bother me. I'm going to sleep.
Yeah, I did the same thing. I was like, oh God, he was right. I mean, it was brutal. But no, we self-selected into, when you see the drive, the determination, the resiliency, you could see those things. And just immediately when we're talking, we knew that, okay, this is a very synergistic moment. Let's see where we can go with it. And it just keeps exponentially expanding. And it's just an amazing gift. And a lot of people don't run into it. And so it's been a real gift to do this.
George and I rarely learn from our experiences because we're already talking about doing a second book.
I know.
Once you get your hire through the door, that's where the talent management and leadership development piece, I mean, you never stop pouring into your people. And Fran, you're passionate about this subject too. But, I'll tell you, if there's one book that has not been done, is taking special operations and creating a book that is specific to startups, of creating those small teams and how you drive a startup based off the special operations methodology. And I've not seen anyone do it to date. They're usually generalist type books in nature.
Well, the how, you have to understand the how, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of people out there who say, oh, I have a vision, but there's not a lot of people who can execute. And so if you can come up with the how, and how do you sit there on day one and say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to execute on this vision. What are the small things that I'm going to do every single day to move towards that vision? Then you can be impactful for anybody trying to do anything. So I like how you talked about writing a book forced you to kind of share and open yourself up. And you guys came together. You really started this tribe, what Mike has referred to a lot as this tribe, right? The Talent War Group Leadership Collective. And Mike, you've been vocal about the loneliness that you had when you left the Navy and you moved to Austin. And so, for me, as your friend, as your colleague, right, to hear that, I think about that and I say, wow, if Mike went through that and I went through that, more people go through that. A lot of people go through that. I'd say everybody who transitions out of the military at some point has to stop and say, man, what did I lose? And I think one of the most unwritten thing that you really lose is this sense of camaraderie, this group around you who thinks a bit or a lot like they share the common values. And it's easy when you sit out and you say, man, I don't have that anymore. How do I get that back? And so, Mike, I'm wondering and hoping that you'll share how you combated that feeling of loneliness, mentally, physically, and emotionally. And how do you sit there in a new place, in a new life, looking for the next challenge and say, I got to wake up today and I got to move forward?
I think my first reaction to that is I didn't deal with it well. And to be honest, Fran, and you're probably in the same stage, I don't think you totally ever put that down, that baggage. I mean, we came from one of the strongest tribal environments known to man. And it was the ultimate support network. And when you leave that, the military doesn't do a good job of transitioning you out. I mean, you get your DD-214. For the audience, that's your exit document, and you're done. You're gone. You're on your own. But when I moved to Austin, I engaged in some behaviors that don't need to be mentioned on this podcast. I wasn't engaging in healthy practices, and I was in a mode of self-loathing, and there was despair. And it took a former commander of mine who happened to live in Austin to pull me aside during the lunch and said, Mike, I've served with you. What the hell are you doing, dude? What are you doing? And he's like, I'm getting word all the way from San Francisco about things that are going on in Austin. And he's like, you need to get help. And in the military, I mean, it was suffer in silence. We are getting better about that, about saying that, hey, the most courageous thing a man or woman can do is raise their hand and say, hey, I don't feel right. I need some help. But that wasn't my generation. And so this former leader, again, stepped up, put me in contact with a gentleman Dr. Chris Free. And we got on the phone. Dr. Chris Free is a behavioral scientist and a psychologist who'd worked at the VA for a long time. He's got several books under his belt. And from Hawaii, he would talk to me. We talked through it. And I had to open up and I had to do something that was very uncharacteristic of me. And, I was closing off people for about 2 years. And I wasn't allowing anyone or looking to join another tribe. I was reclusive in a lot of ways. And Dr. Chris Free and a very good woman, my wife, helped me work through that process in my own way, in my own timeline. And then the ultimate thing for me was, hey, I suffered from what I call survivor's guilt, not PTSD. And maybe survivor's guilt is a form of post-traumatic stress, but I was not upholding the memory of the guys you and I lost. Like, if they were looking down, they were not happy with me, saying, what are you doing, dude? We gave you the gift of life. Live it. Be happy. Be productive. Be impactful on other people's lives. And when I finally started to realize that with the help that Dr. Chris Free and my wife had given me, things started to turn around and I started to do something that I had not done for 10 years. And that was smile. And I smile all the time now because I'm surrounded by people that I love and love me. And that's the power of a tribe, man.
That's amazing, Mike. I mean, and I appreciate you sharing that with us because, I mean, those times are hard. Absolutely, those times are hard. And there's a lot of people who don't make it through and they don't know what to do. And they sit there and that swirl continues and it ends badly. Actually, I went through very much the same thing when I got out. And the worst day of my life, truly, was the day, and I'll never forget, the moment that I was handed my DD-214, as you said, the document that has all your records, and 12 and a half years of my life are contained on a 3-page, a front and a back and a page, 3-page document, handed to me by a very nice lady, but an administrative person in an office. And they take your ID card and walk you out and say, thank you for your service. And I looked and I said, 12 and a half years. And that's what I got. And I got in the car and I cried. I mean, that's it. Because I didn't know. I was scared. I did not know what was next. I had no idea what I was doing. And I knew that when I looked at the rearview mirror, that my tribe, my team, my friends, everything was gone. And I didn't know what was ahead. And so going through that was tough. And so I appreciate you sharing that. And George, I want to give you the chance to respond and do the same.
I think my exit, it was so long ago. It's kind of hard to remember.
They're still throwing rocks back then.
Yeah. I mean, I had to give the reins back to the horse I was riding. I had to water the horse, clean up. No, it didn't hit me right away. We actually talked about it in the book. My career was a little bit different. I got out not long after being in line company command, and I had the tribe, and I loved my time, but I knew I wouldn't be in leadership anymore, or at least not for another 7-8 years. I wouldn't be back with troops. It didn't hit me until I went to my first job because I'd gotten into a veteran. We wrote about it in the book. Literally the first day I walked in the door and started meeting people, I was like, oh shit, what did I do? What did I do? I was doing so well. I knew everything around me. I trusted the people around me. And here I am in Mississippi. And I'm like, just shoot me now. Yeah, it really was a challenge. And so when Mike and I are counseling and coaching and mentoring veterans that are transitioning, we make sure to kind of drive home the point about self-care and building your new tribe and staying connected to your tribe, that you're leaving behind in certain ways. Don't just walk away from it because it's a big, big deal. And I got to tell you, let me put a nice cap on this one. I have a new tribe with Mike in Overwatch in what we've created now in the Talent War Group. And so it's so funny for me because I exited in the 90s and here we are in 2021 and I'm in a whole new tribe and feeling it all over again. And so something to be very, very grateful for. So yeah, suffered through it, not like you guys, and didn't know what I didn't know back then and just thought, just go for it. And yeah, it was a real gut punch.
It's so easy, and Fran, you know this, to hate the military. But people ask me, I'm like, I love the military. Of course, I didn't like wearing a uniform. There's certain, I didn't like anything in garrison. I didn't like standing in formation. There's a lot of things I didn't like. It's so easy, much like risk, to look at all the negative things. But when you look back at the military and the genuine, just lifelong relationships you built with some of the biggest characters, men and women, who are the same people that you watch do selfless acts on the battlefield on a nightly basis, especially as a leader, and we were all, I know, officers, to step back and be like, I led those people?
Yeah.
Well, it's more like they led us. But I'm like, we've got to be some of the luckiest SOBs in the world to have even been associated with men and women like that, and especially have the title leader. That's insane when you think about it.
Yeah.
So they say that work's not work if you love what you're doing. I think we hear that all the time. And we talked earlier about introspection, and that's one of the big things that was paramount to the Jedburghs. I think it's paramount to all special operations that followed them, is you have to be able to take a step back and say, number one, am I doing it right? And number two, do I know what right looks like? But more importantly, am I doing what I want to do? And so now that you have both made this evolution and you wrote the book and you're taking the next steps and you're thinking about another book to have more of the pain, when you self-evaluate yourself, what does that process look like for you?
I was thinking about that because you kind of gave us a little bit of a heads up. And I remember, and so I'm sold, my first assignment was in Berlin when the wall was up. And I got to travel around Europe. And as I traveled around Europe, the more that I saw, the more I realized there was so much more to see than I had time to do. And so when I think about introspection now, and now, having the good fortune to have met Mike, done this book, officiated his wedding, by the way, every day I kind of get up, and then being around Mike's a bit infectious. So I get up every morning, and the introspection is not, am I doing it right? It's like, what did I learn from yesterday? And oh my God, there's so much more to do. I need to get my ass busy because there's a second book out there. There's more people to talk to. There's just so much more out there to do. And I feel like I'm picking up speed even as I go. I love that.
So I think there's a part of being in the moment. I mean, there's a big introspective piece about being in the moment. Do you appreciate what you have? Do you appreciate what you've done? And I mean, I think we all have come from a world where the foot is through the floor. It pushes the pedal through the floor, down to the ground, and there is no stopping. There's no stopping. There's no looking around. There's no looking back. There's no pumping the brakes to say, do I appreciate where I'm at? And I think that is one of the biggest things that I sit here now, 5 years after getting out and say, you got to pump the brakes. You got to appreciate where you're at. You got to love where you're at. You got to take a step back and say, I really enjoy what I'm doing right now. There's going to be things that are ahead, but am I having fun and living life and enjoying it right now?
Oh, yeah. And the other thing is with the team that we built here, we take time to celebrate that. So not just being in the moment, but to celebrate those wins and celebrate those accomplishments, those things that we maybe a year ago we didn't think were possible. And so, yeah, we take the time. And as soon as we're done celebrating, it's like, what's next? What's ahead? But let's go create something. Let's go have fun. Let's take some risk. Let's change something about this, our little corner or our big part of the world.
I'm still sort of figuring this out, and maybe I'll still be figuring it out into the day I die, but I know that the greatest impact in life is not currency. Mm-hmm. The greatest impact in life is that you have on the people around you. So one, am I surrounding myself with positive-minded people that are going to push me to become better? Proverbs 17:27, iron sharpens iron, so as one man sharpens another. Am I surrounding myself with good people? Am I impacting their lives? And then ultimately, I sort of judge my life. And my biggest fear is that every day looks like Groundhog's Day. Am I doing things differently? Am I trying new things? Am I getting out there outside of my comfort zone? And as long as I'm following those sort of three tenets, I think you'll live a impactful, fun life for which you could write a book that your grandchildren would be proud of.
And it might even be with an Army guy, too.
Oh,
you want to talk about getting outside your comfort zone? He did it. You have to give him due credit for that. When we were at his wedding, I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, you want to talk about being outside your comfort zone? I'm like, Army guy, surrounded by Navy SEALs, marrying a Navy guy. I'm like, all right, you better get this shit right or life's going to get...
But George, they put you in charge.
Oh, no. Wait a minute. Because I know his wife's going to hear this. There was no part of me that thought anybody else was in charge other than Jordan. Right. I need that cleansing statement out there, right, Jordan? If you're listening, I promise you I was just doing my part. That's all.
For the record, George was not in charge.
That's right. I'm not in charge. Don't put that stuff on me, Fran. Don't get me there.
And this is worth mentioning. When we held our wedding, I'm a Catholic. I told my parents we're not doing it in a church. It's not going to be the hour and a half ceremony. They were offended. They got over it quickly. We had George serve as the pastor. And I said, hey, George, I hate weddings. By nature, weddings are boring. So you've got to make people laugh. And George says, okay, roger that. I got it. Goes off. And of course, a few days later, he's like, hey, what do you mean by making people laugh? Is it like there's no restrictions? I'm like, go with what you think is right. So my wife is a bit younger than I am. And during his duties, he talks about how he and I met and how he realized that our significant others went to high school together. Those significant others being his daughter and my wife. And literally, the crowd is crying in laughter. I'm on my knees. My wife is on her knees, too, in her wedding dress. Just nailed it. The crowd's like, George was the best part of that wedding. So we'll take that.
Amazing.
You want to talk about the definition of accepting risk? That's it right there. It's either big reward or it's going to be ugly. But yeah, Yeah, who knew, what was coming? It was such a great day to marry two great friends, two dear, loved friends. It was just awesome.
So we got to close out.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're going to do here on the Jedburgh Podcast is we're going to end every one of these episodes with 3 things that were critical to Jedburgh's success. And what I mean by that is they had to wake up every day and they had to do 3 things very well. If they didn't do these 3 things very well, they couldn't do anything else. And that was that they had to shoot, they had to move, and they had to be able to communicate. And so what I want to ask you guys is, when you wake up every day, for each of you, what are the 3 things that you need to do to win?
I think there are 3 components that I need to hold dear, and one is a growth mindset. You have to have a growth mindset in life. It's literally what you use to go to war with complacency each day. And that's the realization that you are a work in progress until the day you die. It's like leadership. And Fran, I know we talk about leadership. The one thing I want people to understand is that we are not preaching from a pulpit. We're not saying we have leadership figured out. We are stewards of leadership and we're fascinated with it. That's why we love to talk about it. We do have some experience under our belt. So that growth mindset is critical to success. 2, this one's coming, humility. You got to be humble. You're never the smartest man or woman in the room. Don't try to be. If you lead a team of 5, 10, 50, 100, consider that the biggest brain trust you've ever been given, and that they will solve any problem more efficiently or faster than you ever could. And then lastly, it's the tribe that we talked about. Everyone needs a tribe. And we often use a word in the military called esprit de corps. And esprit de corps for the audience means a sense of homecoming, fellowship, and loyalty. And when you are surrounded by a tribe, and you don't need to be in the military to be surrounded by a tribe, you've truly got a support network that you can lean on to continually grow as an individual.
Mine can only be additive because he's exactly right.
It's tough to follow.
It is tough to follow, but he's exactly right. So those are the things. So I'm only going to add to that. So it would be 3 and 6. And I had it actually tattooed in Latin on my arm, believe it or not. Pertinacia, fides, and amare. So persistence, faith, and love. So you have that mindset. You have that tribe. You've got to persist. You've got to drive every single day. You got to have faith in you. You got to have faith in your tribe. And you got to have faith in the team that you've assembled to go do great things. And then, like we said, take a moment, appreciate those around you and love them. And, I got a brother in Mike and a sister and his wife. And so those 3 things on top of what Mike did, and every day, if I can do those things, then it's going to be a great day. And it keeps me dialed in and moving forward pretty fast.
Love it. Guys, Mike, George, I'm honored. I'm honored to sit here with you. And I'm honored to be a part of the Talent War Group. I'm honored to be in your presence. You guys have truly done amazing work with writing the book. You've done amazing work with bringing this organization together. I appreciate your candidness here with me today. And I'm living my dream. We talked about introspection. This was my dream. I wanted to do something impactful for people. I wanted to get out there and I wanted to give back to people all over, of all walks of life, who can learn something from the things that we've done. I thought I was going to do it 20 years ago when I went to school. My life took a different turn. It's taken a lot of different turns since then. And I appreciate the opportunity that I have here with you gentlemen. I cherish every day. I appreciate coming on the first episode of the Jedburgh Podcast. We got so many more to come. We have professional athletes lined up. We have academics who have operated with at the most highest echelons of academia. We're going to have CEOs of large corporations, public companies, small businesses, people who've had to endure and grind every single day to win. That's what we care about. We're talking to transformative leaders. We're making a difference in lives every single day. And we hope to have everybody join us again. We'll see you next time. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow. American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh Podcast. I'm your host, Fran Racioppi. We're brought to you by the Talent War Group, an executive search firm and talent advisory. We'll drive you to attract, retain, and develop top talent. With services like leadership development, talent acquisition, and keynote speeches, we work with you and your teams to create talent solutions to business problems. To get started, visit talentwargroup.com. Join us next week for a new episode of the Jedburgh Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Google Podcasts. or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, and the Talent War Group on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and send your comments and inquiries to info@thetalentwar.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh Podcast and the Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.